Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from today, and welcome to the Accelerating the Circular Built Environment in Canada workshop, which is the first official event in the Circular Economy Solutions series under our Circular Built Environment work stream and an official World Circular Economy Forum side event. The Circular Economy Solutions series is a collaboration between Circular Economy Leadership Canada, formerly the Coalition, and Globe series, where we have 6 work streams that are currently underway at the moment, focused on accelerating the circular economy transition across key sectors in Canada and across North America more broadly. My name is Paul Shorthouse. I am the Managing Director of CELC and the Solutions Series, and also a Senior Director with Globe Series and the Delphi Group, leading our green and circular economy work across Canada. I will be your host for today's workshop. I'd like to start by thanking our supporting partners and sponsors for today's workshop, including BCIT, Lafarge Canada, the City of Vancouver and the Vancouver Economic Commission, the National Zero Waste Council, Natural Resources Canada, and Naturally Wood. Before we kick off, I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm fortunate to be participating today from the unceded territory of the Lekwungen and Coast Salish peoples here in Victoria, BC. And also we'd like to acknowledge that attendees are joining us from the traditional lands of Indigenous peoples from coast to coast to coast for this event, as well as a few international participants. So a very warm welcome to everybody on the line. We had close to 250 people register for this event, and lots of interest from industry and from government at all levels, academia, investors, innovators. And I'd like to just get your fingers warmed up by allowing you to introduce yourselves, put your names and your organizations into the chat box. And we'll see who's on the line so far. The numbers are climbing here as we get going. Earlier this year, we launched a work stream on the circular built environment by undertaking some high-level research. The outputs from this research informed the discussion paper that was shared with people in advance, and I'll be sharing highlights from that report with you all here pretty shortly. This workshop today is going to build off of that initial research, as well as build on the work of recent projects and other initiatives from people that are here today, and help us to better understand the business case for advancing circular economy strategies within the built environment sector, with a particular emphasis on what we need to prioritize to advance circularity in Canada's construction and real estate sectors. We're going to start with a couple of polls. I'd like to know a little bit more about our audience for today's workshop and ask you to take a couple of minutes to fill in the 2 questions here on the polls. Where is your organization in terms of circular economy awareness and business models? And why is your organization considering working or looking at circular economy principles more generally? While we're awaiting those poll results, I'm going to walk us through today's agenda, which you can see here. So this virtual workshop will be interactive in nature, so thank you very much for signing up to participate. Over the next 2 hours, we're going to dig into the topic of circularity in Canada's built environment sector to better understand the current state of activities in line with global trends and best practices. We'd like to explore some of the key issues and the opportunities, and also what needs to happen to really move the dial. Over the first hour, we're going to hear from our expert speakers who will provide short presentations on 5 topic areas that will help to set up for the discussions during our breakout room conversations. We encourage you to add your comments and questions into the chat box throughout the event, but please be sure that when you're sending through your questions, you select all panelists and attendees so that everybody can see your questions. Following the speaker presentations, we'll roll up our sleeves alongside our speakers as part of 45-minute workshop breakout discussions to explore the topic areas in greater depth. And you'll have the chance to unmute yourselves then and share your thoughts over the microphone. We'll then come back into plenary and do a brief report back before we wrap up. So before we move into our speakers, I'm going to set the stage a little bit for today's workshop by sharing some key takeaways from the discussion paper that will help to develop a bit of a level set or common understanding across our workshop participants here today. I'm going to ask Nikki or Tansy to drop the link into the chat box for the discussion paper, just in case people haven't had a chance to download it yet. But this is a discussion paper really is focused on sharing information and insights that were sourced from an initial assessment of the current state of circular built environment across Canada in line with the global trends and circular economy strategies. The initial assessment was carried out by the Delphi Group in collaboration with SciAS Advisory and was completed back in March of this year on behalf of Forestry Innovation Investment and Natural Resources Canada as co-sponsors of the research. So we currently live in what has been termed a linear economy, where resources are extracted, they're turned into something of use, products, buildings, what have you, and then often discarded at the end of life. So not only does that put significant pressure on our Earth's ecosystems and bring social challenges and other concerns, it also presents enormous lost economic opportunities from failing to recapture the value of our material resources. The circular economy model provides a framework and business strategies for moving away from the linear take, make, and waste economy and allowing the full value of our materials and resources to be captured during their use and at the end of life. So the circular economy model really aims to sort of align with three principles. Rethink the way that we are doing things to design out waste and pollution through upstream interventions. It looks to optimize our materials and resources by keeping our products and assets in use at the highest value possible throughout their lifetimes. And thirdly, it looks to regenerate our natural systems. So the circular economy is interesting because it also allows us to go deeper on our climate and greenhouse gas emission targets and seek reductions by moving beyond our focus on energy use to consider manufacturing processes and supply chain emissions, things like embodied carbon, as well as our non-energy emissions like land use impacts. And fundamentally, circular economy is about designing out the concept of waste altogether from our products and services. And when you think about that from a circular economy perspective, we can think about waste in four different forms. So wasted resources, where we have or are using materials and energy that cannot be continuously regenerated. Secondly, wasted assets, so where products and assets sit underutilized. For example, buildings that sit empty for too much of their lives. Wasted life cycles, where we have the premature end of use of products, given the lack of repair or maintenance or reuse or adaptability. And lastly, wasted embedded value, where materials and components or energy from products and materials are not recovered at the end of their use through, say, deconstruction or material recovery processes. So the construction real estate sector is one of the largest consumers of raw materials and energy, and also the largest contributor to the waste stream by weight. The greatest impact that we can say associated with the construction sector is the ongoing need for virgin resource extraction. And about half of the extracted raw resources globally are used to make construction materials today. The sector is also extremely wasteful at the moment, with up to about 40% of urban solid waste coming from construction and demolition sector. So while many think of circular economy applied to the construction sector around sort of waste management and diversion, it's important to think about the opportunities as they span across the whole supply chain and the entire building life cycle, from buildings and material design to a building's operations and maintenance, and to the end of life treatment of buildings and infrastructure. There are 5 well-established circular business strategies that look to capture the full value of resources that you can see on the left-hand side here of the table. So circular inputs, which is a business model which uses, say, renewable energy or bio-based products like mass timber, or potentially completely recyclable materials like recycled plastics or concrete as a key input. Secondly, resource recovery, which is a model focused on recovery of usable resources at the end of a product or asset's life. Thirdly, sharing platforms, so a business model which really involves sort of increasing the usage rate of assets through collaborative models for sharing or community access, often using digital platforms. Product as a service, where business models and asset ownership is retained by the producer over the long term to increase its productivity, like leasing models for tools and equipment. And lastly, product or asset use extension, which is a business model focused on extending the lifetime of products or assets through repair or maintenance, upgrading, and resale. So construction, we know, is a really important sector economically for Canada, but similar to the global picture, it's also one of the most wasteful. In Canada, about 3.4 million tons of construction materials are sent to landfill every year. About 1.8 million tons worth of embodied carbon. There was a recent report put out by the National Zero Waste Council that found that about 1.3 million tons of embodied carbon could actually be avoided every year if all buildings renovated or demolished in Canada were disassembled and reused. So a big carbon connection there. The market potential for circular economy solutions in Canada is large, and the awareness interest, I would say, is starting to grow. Fair to say that it's not totally new. We've been doing this to some degree at different levels for some time. Even in 1995, the Canadian Standards Association developed standards and guidelines over the last couple of decades. Some have been extremely relevant here to circular economy practices in Canada's built environment sector, like design for disassembly and adaptability, design for durability, design for deconstruction, existing standards here today. There's also many relevant examples, obviously, of circular business and construction initiatives in action and efforts by industry and governments and other stakeholders, which have been leading to greater material circulation and lowering greenhouse gas emissions. That being said, over the last decades, it's fair to say that the efforts have largely focused on that waste diversion side of things and to some degree the resource recovery, but much less has been focused on the more upstream circular strategies such as circular inputs and product as a service business strategies. So looking to explore some of that today. The discussion paper profiled the current state of circular built environment across Canada, including showcasing a number of leaders and project examples. And it followed a framework based on a circular building's life cycle, which really starts at the design stage. So circular design, and then product and material innovation and manufacturing, including offsite and modular construction. Then construction site best practices, then building use and operations, including long-term maintenance and repair and adaptive reuse. And finally, deconstruction and resource recovery with reverse logistics, looking to get those materials back into the supply chain. It's also, I think, really important to acknowledge that there are many additional actors that support the circular built environment transition in Canada, like governments and regulators at all levels. We have education and training institutions and research agencies, academic think tanks, the role of industry associations and other nonprofits and standards bodies, which are referred to in the report as the enabling ecosystem. So many industry leaders are focusing on those design challenges and working to embed circular building practices and strategies. But given the fragmented nature of our construction sector, we're seeing obviously significant system barriers and existing inertia that has to be overcome. So barriers include cost challenges, the transition from the current status quo. There's a broad lack of awareness or understanding about what circular economy is and what the business opportunities are. We're seeing challenges with respect to the industry and the ecosystem and its fragmentation and silos across the value chain, which create barriers for collaboration or the systems approach that are required. The construction supply chain, we all know, is very complex, and there are many infrastructure gaps, which also create structural barriers to the changes we need. And examples like the market for recycled materials can be very regional or create challenges for cross-border material flow. And lastly, inconsistent policy and regulatory frameworks between jurisdictions create challenges and investment risks in that space. So key enablers really look to tackle these barriers, from embracing circular design at the outset to more education and awareness of those business strategies and opportunities, to cross-sector collaboration in line with systems thinking and technology business model innovation, the support of policies and regulation, as well as procurement that can really help to drive the demand for circular products and services. So there's a lot more detail on all the information I've just touched on within the discussion paper. And obviously we're gonna really dig into some of these issues and opportunities throughout the rest of today's workshop, including hearing more from today's presenters. So without further ado or delay, I'd like to go a little bit deeper together on the key topics for today's workshop as I introduce our expert speakers. We're fortunate to have 5 presenters today who are going to provide their perspectives from across the circular building life cycle. Each of them will present for about 7 minutes, and if we're lucky, we'll have a couple of minutes for a Q&A after each one. So please send us your questions through the chat box during the presentation, and I'll try and select 1 or 2 to share with each speaker. So I will we'll start with Alexander Flash with Arup. And Alex is originally from the UK. He's a senior architectural designer in Arup's Toronto office. He's a leader in Arup's Circular Economy Skills Network, which is a group dedicated to advancing the adoption and dissemination of circular economy principles in the Americas. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Alex for his 7 minutes.
Hi, good afternoon, good morning, everyone, and thanks, Paul, for the invite. It's a great honor to be with you all today, and thanks as well for that fantastic introduction. So I will now start sharing screen. Hopefully you're all able to see that.
Yeah, good to go.
Great. So thanks again, everyone, for being here today. I'm a senior designer in Arup's Toronto office, and today I wanted to share with you some experiences from my own personal circular economy journey, together with some international examples of Arup projects and research. Since 2016, Arup is the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's global knowledge partner for the built environment. Arup, together with EMF and other partners, have been a leading voice for transformational change in the industry through publications, pilot projects, and other initiatives. Research is being invested in at all scales, from cities and systems thinking through to individual sectors or asset types, and down to the science of materials and building components. Before going any further on the topic of design, I wanted to touch on this diagram of the 4 circular strategies, as it shows the different levers that need to be activated so we can achieve a circular economy ecosystem. Circular policy relates to the regulatory framework, circular business to the role of the client and their operations, circular materials to the supply chain. Circular design is key to achieving reduced resource consumption, reduced construction and operational costs, and extension of material and asset life. As designers, we have an important role to play because our decisions have lasting consequences across the value chain. But we cannot act alone, and the move to a circular economy requires all of us to work outside of our traditional silos and collaborate in unprecedented ways in order to bring about the systemic change we're all working towards. Since 2018, I've been very lucky to work with the City of Toronto on their annual temporary parklets, which some of you may recognize. Albeit on a modest scale, it was the need for these to be built off-site and uninstalled each year that has given me a very hands-on opportunity to develop my circular design awareness and thinking. By designing a modular base, we were able to fully reuse the timber from year to year. By reaching out to individuals and local organizations early on, we were able to reduce to a minimum the virgin material used at the outset, as well as the amount of material going to landfill at the end of life. Scaling up to a more complex and typical building project, the layers diagram, first developed by Stuart Brand, is a useful way to approach design. Buildings should be designed in separate but interlinking layers, as they each have different lifespans, making it easier to maintain, upgrade, or replace them independently. Designing for deconstruction means that if the building isn't required anymore, it can be dismantled rather than demolished, with materials and components extracted for reuse at their highest possible value. Designing for flexibility and adaptability means, for example, thinking about the floor-to-floor height, the floor plate depth, column locations, core configurations, riser and plant room sizing and positioning, so that the building can accommodate multiple capacities and uses. Another important layer for circularity is the overarching digital layer that allows for more efficient design, construction, and operation of a building. An early project that allowed us to test a lot of these ideas was the circular building for the London Design Festival in 2016. By working closely with suppliers and together with BAM, Buildings as Material Banks, the project achieved its aims of putting its constituent elements back into circulation at end of life and creating a zero waste building. All materials were tagged with QR codes, allowing for easy identification, sorting, and tracking. One of the main takeaways from this early experiment was the degree to which the manufacturers of long lead and longer design life items, such as structural steel, were not yet ready for leasing models. In the digital age, any material that might be usable but is not tagged and trackable is waste. BIM softwares now allow designers to attach a vast amount of metadata to building elements that can be embedded into material passports. These provide a log of each component in a building, informing how they can be repurposed, and they are one of the keys to circulating value through the economy. In the EU, organizations like BAM and Medasta are coordinating material asset banks and libraries across regions, and are a great example of the open-minded collaboration needed for solutions at scale. Another temporary project that allowed us to push the envelope even further was the 2017 People's Pavilion for the Dutch Design Week in Eindhoven. Working closely with architects Bureau SLA and Overtraders, Arup provided structural design for this iconic project. The facade consisted of over 9,000 interlocking plastic shingles, recycled from PET bottles donated by local residents. The glass roof was borrowed from a greenhouse supplier, while the glass lower facade was saved from a demolished office building. The lighting, heating, furniture, and other interior elements were also borrowed. Designed with easily reversible connections, the pavilion was formed from standard wooden beams, strapped together with steel strips normally used to bind pallets. The 7-meter tall columns were made of prefab concrete foundation piles, with steel rods from a demolished office building being reused for the cross bracing. The structural frame was tied together using high-capacity ratchet straps to create a safe structure capable of withstanding strong winds. To test and validate this unconventional system, several experiments were carried out during the design stage in cooperation with the Technical University of Eindhoven. All borrowed materials used in the construction were returned once the pavilion had been dismantled. Many items were reused in further construction projects, achieving another key circular economy principle of ensuring that materials are kept in use at their highest possible value. And now to a remarkable project in London that is currently nearing completion, 1 Triton Square. A circular design approach and strong collaboration with stakeholders and suppliers enabled this refurbishment in London's West End to achieve a doubling of office floor space with no additional plant space. The project achieved BREEAM Outstanding, and some of the metrics and strategies that helped achieve this were a 54% reduction in embodied carbon compared to an equivalent new build, and 100% waste diversion during soft strip and demolition. In total, 40,000 tons of carbon were saved, which is more than the operational budget needed to run the building for 40 years. Through a plethora of marginal gains across all disciplines and life cycle assessment of all major building components, significant environmental benefits were achieved and at little extra cost to the client. A close collaboration with the demolition company allowed for the original air handling units on the roof to be taken to South Africa and given a new lease of life in another economy. As for material reuse, original paving stones were reused on the new roof. And last but not least, 3,000 square meters of the facade were taken down and reused on the project. To enable this, a temporary off-site facility was set up a short drive away from the site for the inspection, cleaning, and renewal of each of the facade panels. Projects like Triton challenge the status quo of conventional refurbishments and provide hope that it is already possible to start implementing circular solutions at scale. Thank you all for your time today, and I look forward to discussing with you how we can advance the circular built environment in Canada.
Wonderful. Thank you, Alex, for that overview, and great to see some of the global projects that you've highlighted and how they've approached that. There's one question I'd like to just bring forward before we jump to our next presentation, and that is a reference to a project in Toronto called Dufferin Waste that has a circular procurement mandate by the city. Are you familiar with that project, or anything you can share on that?
I am unfortunately not familiar with that project.
Okay, no problem. We can send you that question afterwards, and we can always,
yes, please,
in the report back, report that we're going to share with everybody afterwards, include a feature on that.
Great, thank you.
Excellent. I will go back to my screen here and introduce our next speaker. I'm very pleased to have Peter Sanguinetti from Lafarge Canada join us. He's going to speak to circular innovations in the building materials sector. Peter's a Vice President and General Manager for Aggregates for Eastern Canada at Lafarge. And as many might know, Lafarge is a leading company in advancing circular business strategies within the cement and aggregates sector globally. So with that, I will pass it to Peter.
Thanks, Paul, for the introduction. Very excited to be here. Can you see my screen?
Yes, that's great.
Okay, great. So today I'm going to be sharing some thoughts and maybe more importantly, raising some questions to help us frame a discussion on circular innovations in the building materials sector. Let me start with some quick facts for context on the issue. So as you mentioned, Paul, we generate about 4 million tons a year in demolition waste in Canada. But to understand what this means, if we were going to load highway trucks with this amount and line them back to back, the chain will make it from Toronto to Miami. Every year, we build about 700,000 kilometers of new roads globally, so enough to cycle the Earth 17 times. And if we exclude water, concrete is the most consumed substance on Earth. So in short, building our cities and supporting the way we live has a significant impact on the environment. On the positive side, and because of the scale of the industry, every opportunity we have to increase the circularity of our products and processes represents a significant opportunity to do better. To understand how we can do this, I wanted to highlight the key stages of the typical construction cycle and maybe zoom into some common elements. So fuel is part of all of these stages, regardless if we're extracting aggregates, bitumen, harvesting wood, moving it by truck, vessel, or rail to make cement, asphalt, or plywood. Fuel is powering all our equipment and transportation. We are all familiar with electrification and hybrid technologies, and we're huge proponents of these as a significant opportunity. But I also want to highlight our attention on the use of waste as a non-traditional fuel. And for example, in Europe, currently, about 50% of the thermal energy used to power cement kilns is coming from recovered bottles from landfills and our oceans. We estimate that within the next 5 to 8 years, this percentage can be increased up to about 80%. Transportation is also present in all of these phases. And 1 liter of diesel produces about 2.7 kilograms of CO2 emissions. So at least from an environmental perspective, having our extraction and manufacturing sites close to market does make sense. With this in mind, for example, shouldn't we assess or reassess the accepted uses for recycled concrete aggregates, given that these are typically distributed from depots in urban centers versus relying mostly on virgin materials extracted in pits and quarries further away? And what are the elements preventing us from doing this? And shouldn't we maybe allocate dedicated spaces for this use when we design our cities? Design specifications and regulations are also a significant opportunity to reduce our footprint. When sustainability and circularity are incorporated from an early conceptualization stage in a project, we really optimize the use of energy in an efficient way and maximize the potential to incorporate recycled materials in its development. Some of the current net zero community developments are a great example of this. On the specifications regulation side, let me just put up an example for contrast. In Ontario, a typical MTO highway, like the 401, can accept up to 80% of its road-based aggregates coming from recycled materials. Some municipal and provincial roads currently accept 0 recycled concrete aggregates for the same purpose. So huge opportunity here. When roads and buildings end up their life cycle, there's a significant opportunity to divert the demolition material back into the manufacturing process. But for us to do so in an effective manner, we need to answer a couple of questions. First, how do we qualify the material recovered so that when it's reintroduced in the manufacturing process, this process can be stable? How do we advertise or certify the finished product that uses these materials so that the user can be confident on its performance? How can we promote or ensure that the recovered materials end up in the hands of the industry that can make the most effective use of them? And finally, what are the regulatory, political, economic levers that we can act on so that it is the market the one making these decisions in the most effective manner, right? And again, with these things in mind, I think we can really optimize the percentage of materials that end up in landfills, and we can redirect them back into the chain. To zoom in on some key opportunities, I did mention the use of alternative fuels for cement. I also want to highlight carbon capture technologies. So while this is a fairly new technology, there's multiple types. In general, it uses unhydrated cement as a feedstock. So for example, recycled concrete aggregates. And this feedstock is exposed to CO2 emissions from an industrial process, for example, cement manufacturing. In doing so, up to 70% of the CO2 emitted in the original manufacturing process of the feedstock, the concrete, can be reabsorbed. And by this carbonization process, what we call upcycling, the properties of the recycled aggregates is enhanced, so we can actually use it in higher value applications. Concrete is also evolving to accept greener raw materials. So, for example, glass is being used to substitute sand. Ground calcium carbonate is being used to substitute a portion of the cement. I do want to highlight that I still feel that political will, standards and regulations are one of the lowest hanging fruits that can have the most impact. When we are building 700,000 kilometers of road every year with minimum use of recycled materials, this is really a huge opportunity for us to do better. So finishing just with, again, summarizing these stages and what we feel are the catalysts. And in 7 minutes, we're barely scratching the surface, but really what we wanted to do was to trigger this discussion so that when the World Circular Economy Forum comes in the fall, we can come to the table with clear actions, initiatives, opportunities to really evolve the way we do business in a more sustainable and effective manner. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you, Peter. I have one question. It's not from the chat box. There wasn't anything super specific for based on your presentation, but I found it interesting. You made the point about some local governments are not allowing for recycled materials for road construction, for example. What's the reasoning for that? Is there a perception around risk or quality?
I think there's multiple things to consider. So the industry is partly responsible because in the past, there were some actors that were not producing in a consistent manner, focusing on quality, and there has been a confidence issue. Now the industry has evolved, and I think now there's clear ways to certify that our products are going to perform. Then the other element is, again, the business has evolved quickly, and not all municipalities have the resources to adapt quickly their regulations and standards to reflect those advances, right? So I think those probably are the two main reasons, Paul.
Okay, thank you. There's a couple other questions that have come in. I'm wondering if maybe as the presentations continue, you can see if you have a chance to respond to a couple of those. That would be great in the chat box.
Thank you.
Super. Thank you. And shifting a little bit to the role of carbon in our materials and buildings, the next presenter here, I'm pleased to introduce, will speak a bit to embodied carbon and life cycle analysis considerations in the context of the circular built environment. So James Salazar with the Athena Sustainable Materials Institute is a senior research associate and also the director of their environmental product declaration services, and has over 15 years of experience working with industry as an expert in LCA analysis. So over to you, James. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that, and thanks for the other speakers. That's really great. Hopefully I don't overlap too much with that. So yeah, my background is industrial engineering and product LCA, and been working with Athena Institute for 15, 20 years. And for those of you that aren't familiar, Athena is coming up on its 25-year anniversary next year. Heavily involved in life cycle assessment, probably synonymous with our whole building LCA tool called the Impact Estimator for Building. But we also probably closer to kind of my day-to-day is working with manufacturers on producing LCAs and lowering their embodied carbon, and developing environmental product declarations to help inform low carbon procurement. I think it's important, we kind of touched on the life cycle of a building. This is actually kind of an old graphic. It shows somewhat of a circular mindset, which I think was in the LCA world, very common a number of years ago. You know, LCA kind of came to fruition. One of the primary questions was weighing trade-offs of different approaches to manufacturing and recycling and recovering materials, and to consider those holistically, to not kind of isolate particular impacts, to try and consider all of the trade-offs. What we've seen in the last 5-10 years, I think, is kind of a flattening of LCA into more of a linear approach, wanting to splice portions of the life cycle into kind of nice clean buckets. So those of you that are familiar with the LCA and EPD world these days, this is a very common framework where you start with the product stage, A1, A2, A3, moving through construction and use and end of life. I think it's also important to note that the current LCA standards for building and product LCA include what's called a Module D. And this is really important to the circular economy because this is actually where the benefits of recovering these materials comes to bear. It is important to note that in the LCA world, it's deemed outside the system boundary, but it is you know, a result that you'll see for materials that are recyclable and have you know, energy recovery and things like that associated with them. Practically speaking, to do an LCA, what we're talking about is really summing all of the inputs that come from nature in across all of the life cycle of the building, and then following those materials and energy flows to their eventual fate back to nature. So this is direct emissions to air, land, water, and doing that by looking upstream and downstream to the resource extraction in the initial stages to what happens to the material at end of life. When we do that, we end up with a nice set of potential impact category indicators. I think it's important to note that circular economy, I think, is really, really adept at conserving what we call foreground resources, making sure that you're preserving the highest value for materials as they flow through their life cycle, and designing to do that and implementing recovery strategies, which I'm really excited to hear some of the other speakers talk about. But what LCA, I think, really comes to play into this is to appropriately consider those resource savings and the implications of that against these other impacts. Every action has a trade-off. I really appreciated Peter. He mentioned that you know, there's this movement to recycle more concrete, and it's really a win-win in that situation because you've got this high mass material that has this recovery value close to urban centers. And we do find that quite a bit with, let's say, recovered recycled materials, things like that, that it's a clear win-win situation. But I think where LCA can come in and help inform this is when it's not so clear. Potentially if you've got something that's recycled versus something that is closer or has other implications. There's recovery, energy processes, recycling processing, weighing that appropriately and considering all these trade-offs so you're not, let's say, blind to things that, these externalities, something that's not part of your system that you're looking at. So I think LCA does a great job at that. The Athena Institute has a number of different tools to do LCA. Like I said, I think we're most synonymous with our whole building LCA tool, the impact estimator for buildings. I should mention we also have a pavement LCA tool that's actually quite good at considering, let's say, the trade-offs of recovery scenarios versus preservation treatments versus rebuilding and resurfacing, and really tracking those materials, what happens to them at end of life, and to appropriately weigh that. And I think that what you'll see with the impact estimator, those of you that are in the whole building LCA space, is over the next few months, we'll be releasing a web version of that. It's actually going to be more closely aligned with the pavement LCA tool as it currently exists, with a lot more useful parameters that you can adjust and modify. And part of that is the end of life portion of the modeling. Currently, most whole building LCA kind of applies a generic or average end of life disposition, but what our tool, and I imagine others will be doing similar type work, if not already doing this, is to incorporate the ability to do more sensitivity analysis to really consider those trade-offs of recovering materials versus building with virgin materials. There are other whole building LCA tools out there. We're not the only ones. So those of you that are kind of getting into this space, there's One-Click LCA, Tally, and our tool as well. So I invite you to take a look at all of those and to, to make use of the information that's in that and to, appropriately consider materials in the entire cradle to grave context. I think there's been a lot of movement into EPDs and product level assessment that just look at the cradle to gate, but not necessarily looking at the entire life cycle. One of the new tools that we're very excited about is a Pathfinder for embodied carbon that's coming out very shortly. Those of you that have worked with the Pathfinder for energy may be familiar with this interface. It's a project sponsored by Forestry Innovation Investment, and Morrison Hershfield is also involved in developing this tool. So we're really excited about that in the coming months. It's also the EC3 tool, which I think a lot of you probably are quite familiar with. And this is really, I think, driving the low embodied carbon procurement kind of space. So you're seeing really a proliferation of environmental information about products that just wasn't there several years ago. So I think that's a really critical piece of the story. And you're also seeing in Canada, the National Research Council has a significant movement afoot on low carbon assets and incorporating LCA and EPD into procurement, and really trying to develop LCA data and bridge the gap into, I guess, smooth the ability to incorporate LCA into decision making. And that initiative is actually really exciting too, because we're seeing very shortly whole building LCA guidelines and standards coming out of that working group. So that's a lot to cover. Hopefully I got it in reasonably 7 minutes. So I'm really looking forward to some of the breakout sessions and getting further into these topics.
Awesome. Thank you, James. That was a great overview of some considerations and also some great tools that are available. And you'll see in the chat box stream a number of questions, just given where we're at on the time. Wondering if maybe you're comfortable responding to a few of those in the chat box, and we can come back to as you said, going deeper on some of this in the breakouts.
Perfect, will do.
Wonderful, thanks. So I'd like to introduce our fourth speaker. And just before I do that, we're going to do another poll for the audience here, just to quickly get a sense of the barriers that your organization is facing right now when you think about circular economy approaches and business models in that sense. So feel free to fill that in. And in the meantime, I'm going to introduce Adam Corneal, who's the CEO at Unbuilders, who's going to share some thoughts and examples from his work in deconstruction and resource recovery. Adam, as I mentioned, is the CEO of Unbuilders, and he's also a certified passive house builder and a deconstruction and reclaimed wood expert. So with that, I will pass it over to you, Adam.
Okay, thanks, Paul. And thanks everyone for having me. I've probably done this similar presentation to half of the group already in the past, but I will blast through this as quick as I can here to stay on time. So as Paul mentioned, I am the founder and CEO of Unbuilders, as well as Heritage Lumber, which is our reclaimed wood brokerage. And we are a circular economy, really in one group of companies. So I'm sure many of you are aware of just the sheer magnitude of the issue right now in construction in Canada. Construction is the largest contributor to solid waste in the country, nearly anywhere from 37 to 40% of our solid waste, which translates into 4 million tons on average a year. And when that decomposes in our landfills, it creates about 20 million tons of CO2 that's emitted into the atmosphere. It's a huge contributor to climate change in our country. When you break down that waste, a huge portion of it, over a third of it is lumber. 100% of that can either be salvaged or in the very least recycled. And another portion of that is old growth lumber, which is highly valuable, extremely rare, and should never hit the landfill. So classic view of demolition, which is the typical linear economy. We build our buildings. They either come to the end of their life or someone doesn't like the design, and let's tear it down, throw it out and start again. So clearly just a massive waste of resources. The solution that we have, which other companies are also operating this way, primarily in the US, is the circular solution to the issue, which is deconstruction, and trying to maximize the salvage and reuse and minimize the waste in the end. So on the one side, we have Unbuilders, which provides the service. And then we have Heritage Lumber, which is that lumber brokerage, which sells the materials. We get keys to a new facility on Monday in Vancouver to start remanufacturing and opening up to the public to just generate more sales and just a bigger publicly facing facility. And then we have a great partnership with Habitat for Humanity, as well as the Reuse People, two different charities, but Habitat's our main recipient of goods. And this gives the added benefit of a tax receipt for the owners when we do a deconstruction under a donation model. So we're trying to provide financial incentives for clients because unfortunately deconstruction costs more. So we're trying to make it so that there's financial incentive to do this because not a lot of people are going to do it just because it's the right thing to do or the environmental thing to do, unless there's policy that pushes them in that direction. And looking at what a deconstruction looks like, this is a crane deconstruction of a house that we did. So we're also trying to evolve the service faster and faster every day to try to compete directly with demolition, because the two main hurdles to transition to this circular solution are time and cost. And we're combating both of those with our unique business models and the efficiency and experience that we've gained over the last 6 years doing this. Tapping into what the material is that we're recovering, and this is, this topic is really top of mind, I think, for a lot of British Columbians with the amount of protests going on right now at Fairy Creek and the old growth logging that's occurring. The material we're recovering from every building sort of pre-1970 is old growth lumber. So even down to the 2x4s and the roof strapping that we're taking, this came from big old ancient trees. And this is not just a raw material that needs to be viewed in that way. This is a piece of our history It's part of the heritage of the land that was stewarded by the First Nations before Canada was a country. And every demolition that we allow to occur, this material becomes more and more scarce. It's only found locked behind the walls of our buildings. We need to treat it with an extra care, and this is added fuel for why we need to start deconstructing all of our buildings, at least pre-1970, immediately. And the benefits of old growth lumber, it's 3 times stronger than modern lumber, and reclaimed wood in general has 12 times less embodied carbon than virgin lumber, and lumber's already got less embodied carbon than concrete and steel. So reclaimed wood is literally the greenest building material on the market that you could build your buildings or your finishes with. So if you want to be sustainable, I highly recommend you transition from wood products to reclaimed wood products. And there's a lot you can do with the wood. Basically anywhere that you're installing wood product, whether it's flooring, cladding, posts and beams, furniture, countertops, whatever it is, it can be reclaimed wood. It can get finished. It can get processed in a manner to fit any design aesthetic. It doesn't just have to be the rustic classic look that we are used to. We do a lot of projects where it ends up in a really modern setting, and you can't even tell that it's reclaimed wood. But it still has that added benefit and that added story and history to it. And just tapping into the benefits of deconstruction, I've already touched on the environmental ones, aside from the fact that our landfills are overflowing. So if we continue to work in this linear economy, we're going to have to either expand our landfills and create and take highly valuable land. For instance, around Vancouver, you're looking at up to $12 million per acre. And these facilities are several acres, tens of acres to have a proper landfill. So the solution is curb the waste. This is where I also think policy needs to come in place, or incentives need to come in place, because it costs a lot less to incentivize people to deconstruct than it does to create more landfills. And then on the social impact side, so our partnership with Habitat for Humanity means when you choose to deconstruct or unbuild with unbuilders, some of the proceeds are going to Habitat for Humanity through their sales of the materials, which means you're contributing to the construction of affordable housing as well. And so we get a lot of flack when people see policy changes to say, oh, you're increasing the cost of real estate and you're making real estate less affordable by mandating deconstruction. I have a hard time believing that, and it actually directly fuels the construction of affordable housing. On top of that, there's this added health benefit, which is the dirty secret of the abatement industry. Every building that's demolished still has asbestos in it, and that is contaminating our neighborhoods and our communities and contaminating our landfills and recycling facilities. The only way to actually fully remove the hazardous materials is to deconstruct layer by layer and make sure that they're all taken. I'm at my limit here. I've got 2 more slides. And then just the economics. So this is really for the policymakers. These are sort of the feathers in your cap to really start pushing this policy to see this transition to deconstruction, because it's a massive job creator and it stimulates the economy in a big way. So it does cost more than demolition, as I said, but there's also all the material sales and all the jobs that it creates down the line, which is really great for the economy. So our numbers are very conservative, and just looking at the service itself and the reclaimed wood, and that's 250,000 jobs nationally, $19 billion a year to the economy nationally. It's significantly higher than that in both categories when you consider all the offshoot activity. And so really moving forward to create the circular economy, which is why we're all here today. The industry exists on a small level right now. It would exist on a big level. Policy supported it across the nation. We're seeing this has already existed in Vancouver. Victoria is transitioning that way as well. We really want to see this across the nation. And for those who are developing properties, we really recommend you consider unbuilding them instead of demolishing them, and incorporate the used building materials into your products and into your builds. And for all those designers out there, really to start thinking of that whole cycle, that end of life cycle, and design for disassembly, design for deconstruction, so that you know that when the building is either changed or adapted in the future, that those materials don't have to go to the landfill. They can simply be put back into the supply chain. So it's not waste, it's just wasted. And I think it's time we stop wasting these very valuable materials.
Awesome, Adam. Thanks very much. There's some really great links that people have been sharing in terms of, Victoria's new bylaw, the report done by the Vancouver Economic Commission. Great to see the economic argument that you're making, and great to see, even the Dragon's Den, seeing the business case behind it and going for a $500,000 investment, I guess, in you guys not too long ago.
Well, yeah, we get those checks on Monday.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Right on. Okay, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our final presenter in terms of our speakers today, and that is Joanne Saint-Gaudens with the Circular Innovation Council. Joanne also leads up the Circular Procurement Center of Excellence, and we've heard how important procurement is as a driver of demand for reclaimed and recovered materials. So Joanne is also, people may know the Circular Innovation Council is formerly the Recycling Council of Ontario, but she brings a lot of expertise related to the development policies and practices that help to drive positive environmental outcomes, but using market-based approaches. So over to you, Joanne.
Great. Thank you so much, Paul, for the invitation to be here today. And to all of the previous speakers, thank you so much for all of your interesting content. I've been asked to talk about driving demand for circular materials and resource recovery through procurement, in particular, public procurement, who we all know has an important role to play. And I'm going to delve into that a little bit in the few minutes that I have. Paul did a great explanation of what the circular versus the linear economy really means. And when we think about it through the procurement lens, we always think about the synergies and the differences between what sustainable procurement, which is a pretty common term for us in this industry in particular, versus circular procurement. So for us, we like to think about it this way, that circular procurement is an activity whereby we try to find sustainable interventions or opportunities within a linear economy to try to intersect those different approaches, but still staying within this linear economy, which is really a narrow and very limited way of transitioning to circularity. But when we transition to circular procurement, we're actually looking at construction as a system. And we've heard almost in every presentation before me today talking about collaboration and planning and designing. And so we know that as it relates to construction and deconstruction, that to build circularity into the industry, we need to look at construction as a system, not as a process, which really mirrors the difference between sustainable and circular procurement. So why procurement? Why is this something we want to talk about in this context? Because we don't have circular products or services if we don't have circular buyers. The supply will go where the demand takes us. And so we have to fundamentally change the way that we demand, the way that we construct, and every aspect within construction if we hope to really transition to a circular economy in the built environment. Why are we as an organization really focused on public procurement at the moment? Because governments are not often thought of as consumers or market shifters or changers. But when you think about public procurement, it represents 13% of our total nation's GDP and has a value of about $30 billion annually. And it has not only these direct influences as it relates to its spending on goods and services, it itself as a federal level owns 4,500 owned and operated facilities, so enormous buying power. But it's also a stimulator of an economy, and we're going to be seeing that during the post-COVID recoveries. We're already seeing it globally in terms of the context of incenting or stimulating a green economy. Our governments also fund one another, and so municipalities and provincial governments receive funding from the feds And that funding can certainly stimulate certain activities and accelerate, we think, holds an important opportunity to accelerate our transition to a circular economy. And then, of course, training and employment opportunities that are part of the social benefits that come with transitioning to circularity as well. So huge and very impactful indirect and knockoff effects from focusing on public circular procurement. There's also this disconnect at the moment between the government's broader public policy objectives in the triple pillars, economic, environmental, and social, that are often separated from how governments themselves consume and buy. And what we aim to do as an organization is help governments link those things so they can accelerate and advance all three of those key public betterment objectives through the way that they buy. They are certainly a pace setter and a market shaper, particularly as it relates to their buying power and funding power. And certainly we know that governments are different sizes, different scales, and certainly different locations across the country, depending on whether we're talking about federal or provincial or municipal, but they all have their own local economies in their own rights to advance a circular economy in their communities and should, in fact, be leaders. So when we think about construction and infrastructure, these are the 7 common spend categories of pretty much all governments. We see that here construction and infrastructure basically owns more than half of total government spend. So going back to that enormity of buying power and influence, construction and infrastructure certainly needs to be at the forefront of this transition, and certainly as it relates to the economic drivers, so will it have equal influence in terms of reaching its environmental and social objectives as well. So when we think about procurement and transitioning to circularity, we want organizations and buyers to think about tendering for performance versus tendering for specification. And that's where you're actually starting to require from your vendors, your suppliers, your constructors, the outcomes that you're trying to drive, whether they be carbon neutrality, low impact goods from local suppliers and services, driving zero waste, looking for local employment opportunities or local economic stimulus and training opportunities. We want to look at these procurement opportunities in terms of how they satisfy these broader objectives and drive performance as opposed to draft tendering and RFPs and RFIs that are specified to the types of goods or materials or designs that we want from our buildings. I talked a little bit about the triple pillar or triple bottom line as it's sometimes referred to. We often don't think about how construction projects and our buying power can drive these multiple different objectives. In the case of circularity, simultaneously, we think that in order for us to get to meet our economic needs, we have to, and get the lowest bid, we have to concede the environmental and social benefits that we'd also like to advance as well. But in fact, with circularity and focused on an outcomes-based process, we can drive all three of these pillars at once. So really important that remembering the broad scope and really focused on those outcomes. Paul touched on this earlier in terms of applying the circular business models. We often think about and are more familiar with, and I think in particular from what I'm hearing in the built environment, the first 3 are very familiar. Of course, procuring circular supplies, reclaimed resource recovery, zero waste, product life extension, durability, upgradability, dismantling. We often don't think about and employ the sharing platforms and products as a service. And what we're starting to see in jurisdictions that are a little bit further ahead than we will is that they're really getting at advancing a circular economy by employing really the last 3 or the third 2 product life extension sharing platform and product as a service to really get them to the next level. So that's what we'll be looking for as we start to build resources and tools to help buyers redraft their asks towards circularity. So in terms of what are the immediate transitions we need to make in our minds, I put together a very small cheat sheet, as I call it, for the start to think about how to activate this, moving from concepts to implementation. We heard in every single presentation, and I echo that, it's all about the planning. So a lot of forethought in terms of those outcomes we want to drive and how we get to them. And so that we're really collaborating with vendors and suppliers early on. We're really asking the marketplace to deliver on those values and outcomes that we're trying to drive before we put pen to paper on tenders and RFIs and RFPs. And really provide space, I guess, by, again, accentuating those outcomes that we're looking for to incent innovation and designs and maybe partnerships. We heard a great one with Rebuild and Habitat for Humanity, and that's exactly the kind of innovative partnerships that we want to drive through changing just the way that we're asking for the project to be completed. We often think about lowest cost, and we think about lowest cost at a point in time, but what does that mean in terms of lowest cost overall? And the life cycle assessment is such an important tool, combined with total cost of ownership, for us to really get a sense of what that economic cost might be during the duration, not just the building part, but also the use and the end of life management as well. Working early and often with contractors and trades and suppliers to encourage that creativity is something that we're certainly learning from the European champions, and to along the way track, measure, and share successes and transitions so that we can do some comparisons against traditional builds, so we can really see in real time our gains. And then sharing those market insights and indicators to inform the development of improved specifications to continually engage circularity in construction. So these are some of the big early adoption actions that buyers and those interested and involved in the industry can think about as they start to move into action. We have information, resources, and tools that we've developed as an organization with our mentors and partners internationally that are again a little bit ahead of us, and all of this is displayed on a newly launched Center of Excellence that Paul spoke about early on in his opening, welcoming you all to come and join me and to comment and to utilize. Everything on it is open source and available to you. It's got a tremendous amount of case studies. And we too will be partnering with the World Circular Economy event in 2021 with a very dedicated summit in October for a summit that's dedicated to, in particular, circular procurement. So we look forward to welcoming you there as well. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I look forward to the workshop.
Fantastic, Joanne. Thank you for sharing those useful tips and considerations with respect to procurement. That wraps up a really good overview from different perspectives across the building life cycle and some of the enabling factors like procurement that'll help set up for our remainder of the workshop today. We're going to spend the rest of the time with our breakout topics, and I'm happy to before we sort of break off into those groups, just cover a bit of the ground rules or the rules of engagement so that everybody's clear on how this will work. So we had a lot of interest in this event. Fortunately, we were able to give almost everybody their preferred breakout room topic. In a few cases, we had to move people around a bit to their second choice just to balance out the numbers. But for the most part, hopefully you're landing in a spot that you're keen to dive deeper on. The breakout room leads in each room will be guiding the discussion. We have three sort of key questions that we'll use over the next 45 minutes or so. We welcome your input, obviously, so you can unmute yourselves and share your insights through both the audio, as well as if you would like to use the chat box to provide input. That's no problem at all. You can raise your virtual hand and the breakout leads will call on you that way as well. If you can please keep your comments just really brief and to the point, but also specific where possible, that will help to give everybody a chance to weigh in. We're going to be capturing all of the comments and feedback by note takers that'll be in each breakout room. We just ask that you be respectful, obviously, of the ideas and the opinions of others, and that you share openly. Obviously, feel free to challenge ideas, but not individuals per se. We'll be taking all this input and putting it together in a summary report that comes out after this session. So all the insights from the plenary and breakout rooms to share back with participants afterwards. And we'll try and follow Chatham House rules, which essentially means you can use what you've learned throughout the session, but please no attributions to individuals or their organizations outside of this workshop. And that way, hopefully people are feeling comfortable to share. So with that in mind, we're going to probably keep the breakouts to about 40, just over 40 minutes, and maybe we'll cut the reporting back a bit shorter so that we can wrap up on time. There's a way that you can change your name as it's displayed in the Zoom meeting. So if you wanted to have your name and organization showing up, just go to the right corner of your name, of your screen, sorry, of your little window where your picture is. And you can rename yourself there so that everybody knows who you are, where you're coming from. But with that, I will allow our wonderful Globe team to split us off into our breakouts, and we'll see you back in about 42 minutes. Awesome. Hope yours didn't end too abruptly. We have about 6 minutes left. We were taking lots of notes and some really good information that we can share back with the group. Just given our time, what I was going to suggest is we'll just pick one note taker to present back from each topic area, just to keep it short and sweet, and then we can wrap up, realizing that all of the good content that's been captured will go into the final summary document. So I thought I could just start just to give you an example of what we would like to hear from each group. Our 3 takeaways on recovery and sort of resource recovery and deconstruction were a focus on supportive and harmonized policy in areas like permitting and bans for things that could be harmful and hard to deconstruct at the end of life. Second was knowledge and capacity, both with trades as well as the engineers and building code officials, et cetera, that need to work on allowing these types of projects. And third was sort of awareness around the good news stories, sharing this, the value of these materials, but also the Build Back Better agenda and how this can create new jobs and opportunities for a diversity of people. So that was our breakout room. Maybe I'll go to the circular design room and ask Hank Trim if he's comfortable sharing just 3 takeaways really quickly. Hank, are you with us? There we go.
Yeah, for some reason I couldn't unmute, but yeah, I think, so for I guess the main takeaway was that mandatory regulations, especially modeled on, say, step codes for buildings, are really useful because they set a foundation of where we are and where we want to get to, and then provide incentives for pretty much everybody across the sector to move towards that goal. So I think that was emphasized consistently for all the different questions. I think one of the other strong areas is that I guess provinces and the federal government need to provide leadership, is that there's often discussion of committing to, say, standards for waste, but then there's not a lot of follow-up. And so if without that leadership, it's hard for a company or other individuals to really take action when there isn't really there isn't very much incentive. And then I guess the final thing that came up quite often was need to make sure that you're not working in silos, that when you're talking about a supply chain, it has to incorporate all different types of materials, so concrete, wood, etc., and that there needs to be a focus on performance regardless of what the material is. So I think those were the three big takeaways.
Great. Well, let's just do one more room for time's sake. Maybe George Benson on procurement. What did you guys take away?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Thanks to the awesome room here. Great job by Joanne for moderating. Our 3 big takeaways, and I'm condensing a little bit here. First one was education and change management especially in bringing together the procurement and the policy teams within local governments or any level of government. So there's an understanding of, this is what we're trying to accomplish. This is how we actually manifest that in the procurement process. The second one, as I said many times, was mandates, mandate directives to ensure that every entity in a given public sector organization understands how to procure circularly, and that they have specific criteria, measurements, or maybe even certifications, third-party certifications that they're drawing on that can create both legal and logistical comfort in getting that done. And the last one that was said a few times was really bringing on a total cost of ownership perspective, the entire life cycle of a project, of an asset, so that we don't let this initial sticker shock of perhaps a more initially expensive project preclude the long-term cost savings and the environmental performance of a project like that. So great insights from that room, and lots of exciting work to come, I think. Thanks, everyone.
Awesome. So yeah, I'd just like to wrap up and say thank you to all of the presenters, all the breakout room leads, our note takers and the volunteers that really helped to make this workshop successful. A really big thank you to our workshop partners and sponsors on this slide that you can see here. And of course, thanks to all the participants that really showed up and came ready to engage over the last hour or so. I believe we really managed to capture some useful information that will go into deeper dive conversations in the coming months. Also, keep an eye open for the summary document from today's workshop, which you'll receive in the next couple of weeks with the key takeaways. I think it's really important to stress that we're really at the beginning, though, of this journey to advance a more circular built environment in Canada. We've got a long way to go. The outputs from this workshop will help to guide our next steps within our circular built environment work stream. That's research, that's building more partnerships, looking at shaping our future events and activities over the next 12 or 18 months. If you're keen to get engaged or involved to help us move the ball forward, obviously looking for partners, collaborators, send me a note, send me an email. Happy to explore next steps with you together. Lastly, upcoming events, a couple more solution series events that you could sign up for in plastics and metal mining materials, interesting ones on the solution series website that you can get a link to. And we heard about the World Circular Economy Forum in September. We're planning a major side event on the built environment. This is obviously an event co-hosted by Government of Canada and Finland, bringing together 4,000 participants from 150 countries. So get in touch about that as well. And that includes our workshop. So thank you very much, everybody, for your time. Enjoy the rest of your day. Please stay safe. And I think we've managed to get you out on time.